How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Tzadi Daled, Daf 94 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf Tzadi Daled, another amazing daf here, Masechta Chullin. Two topics on this daf, both of them very interesting in my opinion. The first one is giving, we'll talk a little bit about selling, but primarily giving meat to an ovaid kochavim that contains gid hanasheh in it. Can you give this meat to an ovaid kochavim? Can't you? In which scenarios yes, in which scenarios no? What are sort of the more kind of the social considerations, the neighborhood considerations, the relationship between Yidden and of the kochavim in terms of buying meat and selling? Pretty interesting stuff in my opinion in terms of what are the considerations when giving meat to an ovaid kochavim that has gid hanasheh in it. And we also discuss on this daf Gneivas das, very, very interesting topic about being echad. Was it echad bepeh and echad be? I don't know, but being not exactly so straightforward in your dealings. Anyways, we're going to talk about Gneivas das. Very, very interesting topic on today's daf. So all in all, I think both topics are very interesting in my opinion. So come join me. Let's have a great time learning Daf Tzadi Daled, Daf 94 of Masechta Chullin. Chevir, we begin on Daf Tzadi Gimel Amid Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. At the Mishnah, says the Mishnah, Shaleach Adam Yarech La'ovaid Kochavim. Very, very interesting. Says the Mishnah that a Yid can send, a Yid can send a Yarech. As the Gemara is going to point out right away, Yarech implies an entire leg, a hind leg, a back leg, to an ovaid kochavim. And even though the gid hanasheh is contained inside, because it is clear, meaning you can give a hind leg to an ovaid kochavim, because even if he would end up selling it to a yid, now the Gemara is going to talk about why would a yid be buying meat from an ovaid kochavim? When's the last time you went to an ovaid kochavim butcher shop to buy your kosher meat? So the Gemara is going to talk about why do we have to be concerned bichlal about a yid buying meat from an ovaid kochavim. But anyways, when we're talking about a whole hind leg, well, it's clear that it hasn't been tampered. If it's a whole hind leg, so clearly nobody dug into the leg pulling out a gid hanasheh. So therefore, even if a yid were to buy this hind leg, it's clear that the gid hanasheh is in it, and he's going to have to deal with the gid hanasheh. So it's pretty clear, and therefore a yid can give a hind leg to an ovaid kochavim because it's clear that the gid hanasheh is in it. So even if it is sold to a yid, the yid knows that okay, he's buying meat that has the gid hanasheh in it, and he's going to have to deal with that. So again, says the Mishnah, Shaleach Adam Yarech Levi Kochavim, a person can send a hind leg, a whole hind leg to an ovaid kochavim, shegid hanasheh besocha, and the gid hanasheh is in the hind leg, mipnei shemekomo nicker, because it's clear that the gid hanasheh is in the hind leg and that nobody tried to remove it because it is a whole complete hind leg. Says the Gemara, Yarech lo ovaid kochavim, where am I? Shleima in, chatucha lo. So as I mentioned, in the Mishnah, we're talking about a yarech. Yarech implies an entire hind leg. But if the hind leg was cut up into pieces, and pieces, cuts, right? If the hind leg was already cut into cuts, various cuts, and those cuts were given to an ovaid kochavim, and they had gid, and then the gid hanasheh was in those cuts, the gid hanasheh was not removed from those cuts, that would not be allowed. Again, shleima in, you can give a whole hind leg to an ovaid kochavim, chatucha lo, but if it's already been cut into different cuts, those would not be able to be given to an ovaid kochavim with the gid hanasheh in them. The gid hanasheh would have to be removed from the cuts if you're going to give them to an ovaid kochavim. B'maya skinan. Now, what are we talking about? What's the deal over here? What's the deal with the distinction between a whole leg versus cuts? Why are we even considering a situation where Yidden would be buying their meat from an ovaid kochavim? Like, what's going on over here? Ilema b'makom she'ein machrizin. This is very, very, very interesting stuff. So, as Rashi points out, the assumption here is that we're talking about a town where all of the slaughterers were Jewish. They were all the slaughterers were Yidden. For whatever reason, that was a job that was done by Yidden. So it's a town where there are ovaid kochavim and Yidden living zusammen. They live together. You have in the town, you have Yidden, you have ovaid kochavim in the town. Now, for whatever reason, all of the meat was slaughtered by Yidden. The Yidden kind of were the slaughterers in the town. So whether you are a kosher butcher, whether you're a non-kosher butcher, you're getting your meat from the local slaughterhouse. The local slaughterhouse is Jewish owned and all the slaughterers are Jewish, which means at the end of the day, all of the butchers are getting the same meat. Now we're going to talk about exceptions in a second, but at the end of the day, on a basic level, the non-kosher butchers are also selling kosher meat, lemaisa, because everyone's getting it from the kosher butcher, from the kosher slaughterhouse. So we're talking about a place where all of the butchers, all the slaughterers are shoichtim be'etzim, kosher slaughterers, and we're saying, so what are we talking about this machrizin? Lachriz is to announce. What are we announcing about? Well, so now, given this context, inevitably, animals are going to be treifa. The shchita is going to go, there's going to be nevelas. Recently I went to a chicken shchita, and one of the chickens, there was an improper shchita. It was nevela. It happens. So it's going to happen. So what do you do in such a case, right? We said it's talking about where all of the butchers in the town are getting their meat from the same source. So in principle, essentially all of the meat in the town is kosher meat. But the fact of the matter is, we learned to elu treifis, sircha's in the lung. It's a very common thing. For Yidden, a sircha is a treifa. And we can't eat that, let's say a cow. We can't eat that cow. Now there's absolutely nothing wrong with the meat. Completely healthy, completely good meat. For the Yidden, it's not kosher meat. So that meat is treif. It would go to one of the non-kosher butchers because for them it's completely fine. So now we're going to talk a little bit later on the daf about what your responsibility. If you're going to sell meat to an ovaid kochavim, do you have to let them know it's a treif? Whatever. We can deal with that later. Let me take a shluck of tea over here. So what do we do in a situation where a treifa, right, that day, one of the cows was a treifa? So what's going to happen is that treifa is not going to go to the kosher butcher shop. It's going to go to one of the non-kosher butcher shops. Okay, so now there's actually a concern about treifas over here. So we said, in principle, all the meat is coming from the same source. In the principle, all the meat in the town is kosher. The fact of the matter is, there are going to be scenarios of nevela. There are going to be scenarios of treifa, and those animals are going to end up by the non-kosher butcher. Those animals are going to end up by the non-kosher butcher. So what do they do about that? So now, can you buy your meat from the non-kosher butcher? On the one hand, we're saying all the meat at the end of the day is kosher, but there is a concern that what if there was a treifa? That treifa is going to go to the non-kosher butcher. So what do? So it depends. In some towns, the minig was that if there was a nevela or a treifa that day, they would make an announcement. They would put it in all the local groups, whatever it is. Today there was a treifa in the slaughterhouse, and meaning there's going to be a treifa in the market. Only buy from Yidden today, because by the non-Jewish butchers there is a treifa in the market. That's one option. And that being the case, so we're talking about a town where you're allowed to buy from the non-kosher butchers, because in the event that there's a nevela or a treifa, so then they'll let you know, they'll make an announcement. They'll say, today there's treifa in the market, only buy from Yidden. But on days where there is no such announcement, that means that all of the meat that was shechted that day is kosher meat, and everyone's selling from the same source, and that day all of the meat in the town is kosher meat. you can buy from whichever butcher you like, Jewish, not Jewish, it doesn't matter. So that's in a place where they make announcements were there to be a nevela or a treifa. Now, in other towns, they wouldn't make such announcements, and therefore you would simply never know if there was a nevela or a treifa that day, and therefore you can never buy from ovaid kochavim because you simply don't know if you're buying kosher meat or maybe that day there was a treifa and you're buying treif meat. So in a place where they don't make announcements, you can simply never buy from the ovaid kochavim. Okay, so that being the case, says the Gemara, what are we talking about over here? Remember, in our Mishnah we had said, based on our Mishnah, at the very least, we're saying that you can send to an ovaid kochavim a whole hind leg with its gid hanasheh. If, however, we're talking about a leg that has been broken down into cuts of meat, the gid hanasheh would have to be removed before those cuts of meat can be given to the ovaid kochavim. And so now we're saying, what kind of town are we talking about over here? If we're talking about a town where they don't make announcements when there's a treifa, which means that therefore you can never buy from the ovaid kochavim because you never know if they're selling kosher meat, or maybe there was a treifa that day and they're selling treif meat, so you can't buy from ovaid kochavim. Well, if that's the case, what's the concern? Kilu, we said in our Mishnah, if it's a whole leg, you can give it to the ovaid kochavim. But if it's already been cut up into pieces, you can't. If it's been cut up into pieces, you can't give it to the ovaid kochavim. But who cares? If you give it to the ovaid kochavim, and we're concerned, well, he's going to go to the market today and he's going to sell it, and Yidden are going to buy from him. Nobody's going to buy from him. He's not Jewish. We're talking about a place where they never announce when there's treif or anything like that. So therefore, you're not allowed to buy from the ovaid kochavim. No one's going to buy this person's meat, even if it's cut down into cuts, into different cuts, and it has to get a hanasheh in it. So what? Give it to the ovaid kochavim. Nobody's buying from him anyways. Who cares? Right? The Yidden aren't going to buy from him anyways. So chatucha nami l'shadalei. You may as well even give him when it's broken down into cuts. De'alo. Also, the Mazab Mine, none of the Yidden are going to buy from him anyways. Okay, so let's say the opposite. It's talking about a place where when there is a treifa or a nevela, there would be an announcement about it. And so long as there's no announcement that day, so you could buy from ovaid kochavim. So therefore, we're concerned that you might actually buy from this ovaid kochavim. But if that's the case, then we should be concerned also about the whole leg. If we're talking about a place where they make announcements, which means that by default, there's no announcement that you could buy from ovaid kochavim. So then you should not be allowed to even give a whole leg to this ovaid kochavim. Why? Well, because if the ovaid kochavim is going to go to sell it in the market, right, you're going to give this leg to the ovaid kochavim, and it's clear that the gid hanasheh is still in it because it's a whole leg. Nobody tried to take it out, clearly. See, that's all fine and good, right? The whole concept was that's okay because if any Yid is going to buy it from him, the Yid will know that the gid hanasheh is in it because it's a whole leg. But that's assuming somebody's going to buy a whole leg of beef. That's a tremendous amount of beef. Let's assume we're talking about beef. Obviously, it could be talking about goats or sheep, but let's talk about it's a beef, a lot of meat. Nobody's going to buy when do you ever buy a whole leg of beef? You buy a cut of meat. So this ovaid kochavim is going to be, if he's going to want to sell this leg, he's not going to bring a whole leg and just try to sell the leg. He's going to cut it down into pieces. And therefore, even though, you might give a whole leg to the ovaid kochavim, but we have to assume that he's not going to sell it as a whole leg, he's going to cut it down into pieces. And we said that once it's cut out into pieces, then we would be concerned that somebody's going to buy those pieces and they're going to have the gid hanasheh in them. Let me take a shluck of tea. So says the Gemara, second line of the Gemara. So we're talking about a place where they make announcements when there's nevela or treifa, and by default you can buy from ovaid kochavim. Well, if that's the case, shlema nami lo lishadalei, you shouldn't even be able to give him a whole hind leg with the gid hanasheh, because the chatich le mezabel is going to cut into pieces, and sell those pieces. And people are going to end up buying those pieces that have gid hanasheh in them. So I can answer you in two ways. I can answer you whether we're talking about a scenario, a place where they make announcements, and therefore you could buy from ovaid kochavim so long as there's no announcements, or a place where they don't make announcements and you can never buy from ovaid kochavim. So I can answer you for a place where they make announcements, and by default, so long as there was no announcement that day, you could buy from ovaid kochavim. And yet we said that you could sell a whole, that you can give a whole hind leg to an ovaid kochavim. What about the fact that he's going to break it down into cuts, and people are going to buy, Yidden might end up buying those cuts, and they'll have to get a hanasheh in them? The Gemara gives a very interesting answer. You hear that? Very, very interesting answer. Very, very interesting answer. We're saying in a place where they make announcements about when there's an ovaid and treifa, and so long as there's no announcement that you could buy from ovaid kochavim. Okay, so you could buy from ovaid kochavim. Okay, we're saying that you can give this hind leg to an ovaid kochavim with the gid hanasheh in it. Now people might buy meat from that ovaid kochavim, right? And we're concerned that he's going to break it down into pieces. That's not actually a concern. It's not a concern because the type of cuts that this ovaid kochavim is going to cut into are not, they're different than kosher cuts. Because a kosher butcher who's going to be cutting up a hind leg into cuts has a very difficult design challenge, which is he needs to design his cuts in ways that would take into consideration the fact that there's the gid hanasheh. Right? The gid hanasheh is going to have a humongous influence on the way that a kosher butcher is going to have to design his cuts of meats and what cuts are available as kosher cuts of meat from a hind leg. You got this gid hanasheh running down the entirety of the hind leg and all of its branches and its knukvias and all sorts of stuff. It's a very difficult problem for a butcher who's cutting up the hind leg, and therefore the kosher cuts from a hind leg are going to be specific types of cuts that were designed with the gid hanasheh in mind, the fact that the gid hanasheh is going to have to be removed from the hind leg, and all of those cuts are going to have to be able to work within that limitation. A non-kosher butcher or this person this ovaid kochavim who was given this hind leg, and now we're saying, well, he might cut it up into his own pieces. He's not going to be taking into consideration this very tricky challenge of the gid hanasheh. I was watching the other day this master butcher. That's what it was called, like a master butcher. He seemed like a great butcher, But anyways, this butcher from England, his name was Nigel. Seemed to be great. Know what he's doing, but I saw him cutting up a hind quarter of beef. He was not taking into consideration the gid hanasheh. I'll tell you that much. He seemed to do a great job, but he's cutting right into the beef. He's not thinking about designing cuts around the gid hanasheh. So therefore, says the Gemara, we could say that it's talking about a place where they make announcements when there's an ovaid and treifa, which means that by default you're allowed to buy from an ovaid kochavim, and yet we say no problem, you can give a whole hind leg to an ovaid kochavim, even though, yeah, sure, he might cut it up into pieces, but it'll be clear that those pieces are not the kosher cuts. Kosher cuts are very, very specific cuts that are taking very tricky design limitations into consideration. It'll be clear that those are not the kosher cuts, and Yidden are not going to buy them. Those are not the kosher cuts. So again, I could tell you that it's talking about a place where they announce when there's an ovaid and treifa, and you're allowed to buy from ovaid kochavim, and yet it's not a problem to sell a whole hind leg to this, to give a whole hind leg to this ovaid kochavim, even though he's going to break it down into cuts, because chitucha ovaid kochavim made the yediyah, it'll be clear that these are the cuts of an ovaid kochavim, that these are not kosher cuts, and Yidden are not going to buy them. However, as we said, you cannot give kosher cuts to an ovaid kochavim, right? If you had, right, we said you can only give a whole hind leg to the ovaid kochavim, but if you had already cut them up into the kosher cuts but left in the gid hanasheh, well, that's going to be a problem, because if people will see, oh, these are the kosher cuts, and they'll assume that the gid hanasheh was removed, and that'll be a problem. So you'd have to remove the gid hanasheh first if you're giving kosher cuts to the ovaid kochavim. Now, v'iba yisema b'mokum she'ein machrizin. Alternatively, I could say that it's talking about a place where they don't make announcements, and therefore you're never allowed to buy from ovaid kochavim. Well, if you're never allowed to buy from ovaid kochavim, so then what's the concern about even giving the kosher cuts with the gid hanasheh to ovaid kochavim? Nobody's buying. None of the Yidden are buying from him. Well, the concern is, what if there's a Yid? Let's call him Ruvain. What if Ruvain, so sure, it's in a place where they don't make announcements, and therefore you're never allowed to buy from ovaid kochavim. However, Ruvain notices something very interesting. He has some inside information that he happened to witness, that this particular ovaid kochavim was given these cuts of meat. That this particular ovaid kochavim was given kosher cuts of meat. And Ruvain, this observer, is going to say, okay, well, I happen to know that this ovaid kochavim was showing up in the market with these kosher cuts of meat, was given these kosher cuts of meat by a Yid. And Ruvain is going to go and buy those kosher cuts of meat from the ovaid kochavim. So therefore, out of concern for such a scenario where somebody named Ruvain might observe these kosher cuts being given to the ovaid kochavim, we say that even in a place where there are no announcements, and therefore by default Yidden are not allowed to buy from ovaid kochavim, nonetheless it would be forbidden to give kosher cuts of meat to an ovaid kochavim when they still have their gid hanasheh in them. The gid hanasheh would have to be removed beforehand. The iba is ema. Alternatively, mishum dika gonev ledaite. Alternatively, because of Gneivas das. Again, even if it's in a scenario where no Yidden aren't buying from the ovaid kochavim, so there's no concern that in a place where they make the announcements and Yidden can buy from the ovaid kochavim. So of course there is a real concern about kosher cuts having the gid hanasheh in them. We're saying even in a scenario where there are no announcements and therefore nobody's buying from the ovaid kochavim. Let's assume that we're not concerned about this Yid named Ruvain observing anything, and therefore people aren't buying from the ovaid kochavim. So therefore, what's the problem with giving these kosher cuts to the ovaid kochavim with the gid hanasheh? We're not concerned that any Yid is going to buy them. Gneivas das. What does that mean? It means that you're going to give these kosher cuts to the ovaid kochavim, and the ovaid kochavim is going to notice. He's going to say, "Oh wow, these are not the cuts that I'm used to. These are the kosher cuts." And he might not know exactly what the kosher cuts are, exactly why it's so tedious, or about the gid hanasheh, or what to look for, or whatever. But he knows that, wow, yeah, these are the kosher cuts. The kosher cuts are very difficult kind of cuts to make. They have to design it around this whole gid hanasheh with all these knuknis. He knows that the kosher cuts are very specific cuts and they're very more difficult to make. And he's going to receive these kosher cuts and he's going to say, wow, that was really, really nice of this Yid to give to me as a gift these kosher cuts of meat that must have taken him hours and hours and hours to cut. I'm really touched. That was a very, very nice thing for this Yid to do. Now, the fact of the matter is, we're saying that, this could be a scenario where the gid hanasheh was not actually removed. And all that hard work of removing the gid hanasheh wasn't, he didn't actually do all the hard work. So that would be Gneivas hadat, right? That would be Gneivas das, right? If we were to allow a Yid to give these cuts of meat, these kosher cuts of meat to an ovaid kochavim with the hanasheh in them, so the ovaid kochavim might be getting fooled, right? He might think that the yid is giving these kosher cuts of meat, and wow, what a nice gesture. He spent all that time making these kosher cuts for me. Fact of the matter is, it really didn't take that much time, because the hard part is getting rid of the gid hanasheh, and he didn't actually do that, and that would be misleading. And Shmuel says, Shmuel also lignov das abrios va'afilu daitashov kochavim, and says Shmuel, Gneivas das is not allowed. You can't be misleading to people. You can't give this ovaid kochavim kosher cuts of meat, and he'll think that, wow, so much effort went into preparing them, when the fact of the matter is, the hard part is removing the gid hanasheh, and this has the gid hanasheh in it. And therefore, you're not allowed to be misleading, whether to a yid, whether to a non-yid. It makes no difference. You have to be straightforward. If you're giving kosher cuts of meat, they have to, in fact, be kosher cuts of meat. They can't have the gid hanasheh in them. Now, this that Shmuel said, that it's also lignov das abrios, he never actually said that explicitly. But it is implicit in the following story. One time, Shmuel had to pass a river, he had to cross a river, so he took a ferry. There was a ferry driver. The ferry driver would go back and forth from one side of the river to the next, and you would pay him to get from one side to the other. So Shmuel said to his attendant, compensate the skipper, compensate the ferry driver for the trip. So the attendant compensated the skipper. The ikbid, and Shmuel got upset. My time ikbid. Why did Shmuel get upset at his attendant for compensating the skipper? So Abaye says, Abaye, Tainagolis treifa avoy v'avanile b'may deshkuta, because it was Gneivas das. What was Gneivas das? Because the attendant compensated the skipper with a chicken. He gave him a chicken. That was a payment, not cash. Payment in a chicken. And that chicken was a treifa. Now, for the skipper was not Jewish. So the fact that it's not kosher for a yid because it's a treifa doesn't matter for the skipper. But even so, the Shmuel got upset with his attendant for giving the skipper a treif chicken, kind of under the assumption that it was a kosher chicken. And therefore it was Gneivas das. Rava Omer says, Rava, Anpaka Omle Lashkuye Vashkaye Chamra Miziga. Rava says that the issue was that Shmuel instructed his attendant to compensate the skipper with a revius of wine. Now the assumption was that should have been strong, undiluted wine, Vashkaye Chamra Miziga, but the attendant gave the skipper diluted wine, and again it was Gneivas das because the skipper assumed that he was going to be receiving strong, undiluted wine, and he was given diluted wine. So we see that whether like Abaye, who says about the treif chicken, or whether like Ravit, who says about the diluted wine, in both cases Shmuel got upset that it was misleading, that the expectation was that the skipper was going to receive one thing, but in reality, he received something else. V'chi michlala mai, frag Gemara, great, amazing. So we see from this story that Shmuel holds that Gneivas das is forbidden, whether to a yid or a non-yid. Now, frag the Gemara, why is it important for the Gemara to have pointed out that Shmuel never said this explicitly, but rather it's implicit from the story with the ferry? Why is that important for us to know? At the end of the day, the shita is the same, that according to Shmuel, Gneivas das is also. So, and for the Gemara, here's the difference, because technically if Shmuel would have said it explicitly, well, then we would know explicitly that that's his shita. But because it isn't explicit, it's implicit from the story, you could potentially draw alternative conclusions from the story. Lemanda Amar Treifa Avoy, according to Abaye, who says that it was a treif chicken instead of a kosher chicken, Omerle Amai Tasha Isura. Well, technically you could draw an alternative conclusion, which is the reason why Shmuel got upset with his attendant is not because of Gneivas das, but rather Shmuel was saying, why do you have a treif chicken on you? If it's treif, you should throw it out right away. Why? Right? I went to a chicken shechita a few weeks ago. The one of the chickens was nevela. You threw it out. So, what are you going to do? Why'd you keep this treif chicken around? Maybe that's why Shmuel got upset, because the attendant kept a treif chicken around. You should have thrown it out, not because of Gneivas das. Now, Lamanda Amar an poko, and according to Rava, who said that he poured him diluted wine when really it should have been undiluted wine, Omerle le'ashkuye an poko chaya mashma. So you can say that again, Shmuel, it wasn't an issue of Gneivas das, but rather Shmuel simply got upset that the instruction was for undiluted wine, and the attendant didn't follow the instructions and rather gave diluted wine. So you could say that Shmuel simply got frustrated with his attendant for not doing what he was instructed to do. So again, you could potentially come up with alternative conclusions from that anecdote. That's why the Gemara did not want to say explicitly that Shmuel says Gneivas das is osur, and rather the Gemara made a point of saying that it's implied from the story, just to point out, because it is possible that you can have other conclusions there. But the fact of the matter is, we do assume nonetheless that Shmuel's shita is that also lignov das abrios vafilu daita shel ovaid kochavim. The Gemara is now going to give different scenarios where we have to be concerned about Gneivas das. Tanya, we learned in a brayso Rav Meir Omer that Rav Meir would say, Al yisarev odom lachaveru lisod etzlu v'yodea bo she'enu soid. A person shouldn't insist that somebody should come over to his house for a Suda knowing that he's not going to come, right? Don't invite over your friend for a Shabbos Suda. Mamish, it would make our whole Shabbos. We'd love for you to come. It would be the biggest honor if you came to our house for Shabbos Suda. And you know that he's away for Shabbos, so he's not going to come. So don't do that. Make him think that you really want him to come. The fact of the matter is you don't. Don't insist that he accept gifts from you, knowing full well he's not going to accept them. Right? If Reuven goes over to Shimon's house, and Shimon says, wow, Reuven, it's so great to see you. Wow, I'm going to open up a barrel of wine so that we can have a glass of wine together. And Reuven says, what? You're going to open up a whole barrel of wine just so we can have a glass of wine? Right? Remember when the Malachim came to Avraham Avinu? And Avraham Avinu, it says in Rashi that Avraham Avinu slaughtered three cows, right? Just so that they can get the tongues. Just so they get the choicest thing. He slaughtered 3 whole cows just to get the tongue. Reuven says, well, you opened up a whole barrel of wine. A whole barrel, just so we can have a glass of... Wow, Reuven thinks it's the biggest honor in the world. The fact of the matter is, Shimon actually already sold this barrel of wine. Right after they have the glass of wine, that barrel of wine is going right to the store. It's already been sold. It's really not that big of a deal. But Reuven thinks it's the biggest deal in the world. So the fact of the matter is, Shimon is misleading him. Shimon is making him think that he's doing so much for him. The fact of the matter is, he really isn't. So in that case, Shimon would have to be transparent. He would have to say, look, I would like to have a glass of wine with you. The fact of the matter is, though, just so you should know, it has already been sold. This isn't like that big of a deal. V'lo yom lo, meaning I love you and everything, but I do need to be transparent. V'lo yom lo soch shemen mipach reikin v'mishva kvodo muter. Also, shouldn't say, oh wow, come, let me bring out some oil for you so you can, I don't know, anoint yourself with oil. I guess that's a very nice thing to do. But the fact of the matter is, there isn't actually any oil in the oil container, and he just knows that Reuven isn't going to accept it. So it's kind of a fake kavod. Although we do say it's allowed, right? We say, Vim bishvil kvodo mutter. But let's say it's a place where there are other people there. It isn't just Reuven and Shimon. There's a little bit of an oilam there, and Shimon is offering Reuven some of this oil or whatever, and Reuven's not going to, it's empty, and Reuven's not going to accept it. But the fact of the matter is, it shows honor to Reuven that Shimon was machshav him to want to offer him some of this oil or whatever. So here it's not an issue of Gneivas das. Here it's an issue of, the fact of the matter is it's showing kavod to Reuven, that shows that Reuven is a person that is chashav enough that people want to offer him such things. So it actually gives him kavod, and it's not an issue of Gneivas das anymore. It's actually showing kavod to a person, and it's okay. Ini, is this really true that if you're going to open up a barrel of wine for your friend, you have to tell him if it's already been sold? Ula ikla levei Rabbi Yehuda. Ula visited Rabbi Yehuda. Pasach lo chavius hamechuris lechenvani. And what did Rabbi Yehuda do? Rabbi Yehuda opened up barrels that in fact had already been sold. Oduye odai. So the Gemara answers two answers. The first one is, in fact, Rabbi Yehuda told Ula that they were already sold. Alternatively, v'baisema shiny Ula dichaviv le Rabbi Yehuda dibelavachi nami psuche maftach le. Alternatively, Ula was very chashuv to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda really respected Ula and would, b'chol anyways, he would have opened up a barrel just for Ula. So the fact that he had technically already sold the barrel is just really a technicality, because whether he would have sold the barrel already, whether he had sold the barrel already or not, either way, Ula was chashuv enough that Rav Yehuda would have anyways opened up a whole barrel for Ula. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Lo yelech adam leveis ha'avel uviyado legin amiskashkesh. A person should not go to a house of mourning with a flask that is not full. A flask where, right, in kashkesh, it's like it's like slashing around, but with a flask of wine that is not a full flask of wine, and the wine's kind of splashing around in there, i.e., you shouldn't go with a flask of wine and the Avel is going to think you brought a whole flask. The fact of the matter is, it's not whole. It's missing some. It's incomplete. It's deficient. V'loyim la'enu mayim. Also, you shouldn't top off a flask of wine with water. Mipnei shemaseu. For the same reason, because the Avel is going to be thinking that you brought him a full flask of wine. The fact of the matter is, it's been uncle matid. It's been diluted with water. Ve'im yesh sham chaverir mutter. But if there's a shtickle oilam over there, if there's a bunch of people over there, and you're going to come with this flask of wine, in that case it is okay, even if it is not full, because it shows kavod to this avel in front of these other people that you're coming with a flask of wine, and that's what they see. They see that you are giving kavod to the avel, rather than focusing on the technicality. Is it full? Isn't it full? In such a case, it gives honor to the avel, and then that would be acceptable. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Lo yimkor adam lachavero. A person should not, right? Shimon should not sell to Reuven sandal shel mesa bichlal shel chaya shchuta. A sandal, a leather sandal. So the shaila is, in this case, what kind of hide was the sandal made of? Was it made of the hide of an animal that was slaughtered, and then its hide was used to make this sandal? Or maybe it was an animal that died, and you found a dead animal and used hide from a dead animal. So says the Gemara, Lo yimkor adam lachaver sandal shel mesa. Shimon should not sell Reuven a sandal that was made with the leather of a dead animal, bichlal chaya shchuta, under the assumption that Reuven was buying sandals made from leather from an animal that was slaughtered for its leather. Mipnei beis dvarim for two reasons. Echad mipnei shemaseu. Firstly, it's simply misleading. It's Gneivas das. Reuven thinks he's buying one thing, but in fact he's buying something else. Ve'echad mipnei asakana. Alternatively, it could potentially be dangerous. How did that animal die? Was it bit by a snake? Was it poisoned? Is there poison in the hide? If a person puts on those sandals, can he get foot poisoning? I don't know. So therefore, you got to be transparent. Don't send to your friend a barrel of wine that's topped off with oil, which means that the friend is going to receive the barrel and think he's getting a barrel of oil because there's oil at the top of it. But the fact of the matter is it's wine. There was a tragic story where somebody sent to his friend a barrel of wine that was topped off with some oil, and the friend thought that he was getting a barrel of oil. So what did he do? He invited over some friends. They were going to have a great night with lots of oil. And he invited a bunch of friends. And then, when time came to bring out all of his oil, he realized this isn't oil, this is wine. And he was so embarrassed that he invited all of his friends to have oil, and he didn't actually have oil to serve them. All he had was wine. So he strangled himself to death. And another tragic halacha, or another halacha that has a tragic story with it, that the guests are not permitted to give from their portions to the children of the host, unless they have permission to do so from the host. There's a tragic story. There's a story where somebody invited over 3 guests, and it was a period where there was not a lot of food available. And all he had to offer his guests was eggs. He had 3 guests, and he had 3 eggs, and all he had, the fare that he had to offer his 3 guests was 1 egg each. Babno shabalabayis, and then the child of the host came into the room, into the dining room. Natal echad man chelko v'nosno lo. So one of the guests took his egg and he gave it to the child. V'chen sheni v'chen shlishi, and the other 2 guests did the same thing. They gave their eggs to the child as well. Ba'aviv shel tinok mitzvah she'ozek echad b'fiv v'shtayim biyado. And the father of the child came into the dining room, and what does he see? The guests' plates are empty, and the child has 1 egg in his mouth and holding the other 2 eggs in his hands. And this was a time when there was not much food. This was all he had, and he had nothing else to feed his guests now, because they gave their fare to the child. And the father was the host was so upset. Chavto bakarka, he basically beat up his kid, umeis, and the child died from the beating. Kavan shirasa imo, and then the child's mother saw that her son was dead. Also lagag v'nafla v'mesa, she jumped off the roof and committed suicide. Afu ala lagag v'nafla v'mesa, and he committed suicide too. The whole family died because the guests gave their eggs to the child. The child's dead, along with his 2 parents now. Amr Reb Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Al davar zeh nergu shalosh nefashos miYisrael. That based on this concept of don't offer your food to the children of the host without permission, 3 people died because of this thing. My kamash balon. Why does the Brisa need to point that out? And Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that 3 people died. We know 3 people died. That was the whole story. That's the whole point. The kid died and the 2 parents died. That's 3 people. The chula, kamash malon. So my kamash malon, the chula Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Yeah, the reason what it's saying is basically the whole brisa is in fact Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. It's Kilu. It says Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, don't give the food from your plate. I think what else was in that brisa? Was that also don't send? Don't. I think the point is the whole brisa, which also includes, I guess, don't sell the sandals with the leather, with the leather of a dead animal, and don't send the wine with the oil, and don't give your food to the children in the house. That was all Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Now we get back to the sugya of sending meat to the ovaid kochavim with the gid hanasheh. Tanu Rabbana, the rabbis taught, hashalech yorich lachavero. If somebody sends a hind leg of meat, let's say it's beef, to his friend, shlema, if it is a complete hind leg where it is clear that the gid hanasheh is still in there, it hasn't been tampered with, so enu tzarich sheitol imeno gid hanasheh. You don't have to remove the gid hanasheh because it'll be crystal clear to your friend that is receiving a whole leg with the gid hanasheh, and he's going to have to deal with that. Chatucha, but if he's sending to his friend a hind leg that has already been cut into cuts, you have to make sure that the gid hanasheh is removed so that your friend doesn't think that the gid hanasheh has been removed and eat it. Ovaid kochavim, now says the brisa differently than our Mishnah. Ovaid kochavim, when it comes to ovaid kochavim, bein chatucha, bein shlema, ein tzarich litol hemeno gid hanasheh, that if you are sending this meat to an ovaid kochavim, so regardless of if it's a whole leg or if it has already been cut into pieces, either way, the gid hanasheh is allowed to be in there, and the Gemara is going to discuss what is the scenario that we are talking about. You're allowed to leave the gid hanasheh in there. And for two reasons, and for two reasons we say we don't sell. This is the first time on the daf we're talking about selling. We say don't sell nevelas and treifas to a ovaid kochavim. So first of all, well, if you're going to sell nevelas and treifas without telling him that it's nevelas and treifas, that would be Gneivas das, like we have been talking about. It's misleading. He'll think that you're selling him kosher meat, but the fact of the matter is you're selling him nevelas and treifas. Be'echod shema yachzor v'imkren Yisrael. And secondly, if you sell this ovaid kochavim, nevela and treifa, maybe he will then sell it to a yid, and the yid will now be buying nevelas and treifas. The Gemara is going to discuss in what scenario we're concerned about the yid purchasing this meat. And a person should not say to an ovaid kochavim, kachli bedinar zeh basar mipnei beis dvarim. A yid should not say to an ovaid kochavim, here is a dinar, can you please go to the market and buy me some meat with this dinar, for two reasons. Well, maybe this person will be a bad guy, and he's going to go and he's going to steal the meat. You'll give him this dinar, and you'll say, go buy a dinars with the meat. He'll go and get you a dinars with the meat, but he's not going to pay for it. He's gonna steal it from some butcher, and he's going to keep the dinar for himself. And we don't trust this guy, this ovaid kochavim. And secondly, ve'echad, a separate concern is shema mochrin lo nevelas utreifis. Well, maybe they're going to sell to him nevelas and treifis, and you're going to be receiving nevela and treifa meat. This brisa requires a bunch of understanding, of explaining, and we are going to do that explaining now. Amar, we just said, so basically that brisa had four scenarios in it. Giving meat to a fellow yid, giving meat to an ovaid kochavim, right, with the gid hanasheh in it, selling nevelas and treifas to an ovaid kochavim, and asking an ovaid kochavim to buy meat for you, giving him money and asking him to buy meat for you. We are going to be discussing the last three. We won't be discussing giving meat to a fellow yid. That was pretty straightforward. If it's a whole leg it's okay. If it's pieces, you got to remove the gid hanasheh. It's the next three cases that we're going to be discussing. Or we said, ovaid kochavim, if you are giving meat to an ovaid kochavim, ben shlema ben chatucha eino tzarich lito lemena gid hanasheh. Whether you are giving the ovaid kochavim a whole hind leg, or whether pieces, either way, you can give it to the ovaid kochavim. You don't need to remove the gid hanasheh. But my eskinon, what are we talking about? Well, if we're talking about a place where they announce, right? Remember, from the beginning of the daf, we're talking about where all the slaughterers are Yidden, and what happens, right? So all the butchers in the town, whether they're Jewish, whether they're not Jewish, they're all getting the same meat. What happens if there is an avela or a treifa? So they make an announcement. Today there was an avela or a treifa. There is non-kosher meat that's going to be in the market today. Only buy from kosher butchers. But so long as there is not such an announcement, you can buy from whichever butchers you want, kosher, non-kosher. So chatucha amai eino tzarich lito emena gid hanasheh. If we're talking about a place where they make announcements, so then by default, if there's no announcement, you're allowed to buy from the ovaid kochavim. Now, we said in the brisa that you can give this meat to the ovaid kochavim, whether it's a whole leg, which, okay, I can understand. But we're saying that whether it's a whole leg, whether it's already been cut into pieces, you can give it to the ovaid kochavim with the gid hanasheh. However, came to l'achos, if we're talking about a day where there was no announcement, also the mizabin mine. Well, then Yidden are going to buy the meat that's already been cut up into the kosher cuts and has the gid hanasheh in it. So elapshita b'makom she'ein machrizin. So rather than mele, this what we're referring to as the reisha, right? This case must be talking about a place where they don't make announcements, and therefore you never know when there's nevela and treifa in the shuk, and therefore you can never buy from ovaid kochavim, and that's why we're saying in this brisa that you can send meat to an ovaid kochavim, whether a whole leg, whether cut up in pieces, even if it has the gid hanasheh in it, because it's a place where the Yidden aren't going to be buying from an ovaid kochavim anyways. But ema mitziasa. So if we're saying that it's talking about a place where they don't make announcements, what about the next case? For 2 reasons they said we don't sell nevelas and treifas to an ovaid kochavim. One is that, well, if you don't tell him that it's nevela and treifa, it's Gneivas das. Ve'echad shema yachzor v'imkrena liYisrael acher. And a second reason is we're concerned that if you sell nevela and treifa to an ovaid kochavim, he's going to sell it to a yid. Now, in what case are we concerned where he's going to sell it to a yid? And if we're talking about, like we explained, the reisha where they don't make announcements, well then, no yid is going to be buying from the ovaid kochavim. Why are we concerned that the ovaid kochavim is going to sell nevela and treifa to Yidden? If it's a place where they don't make announcements, well then Yidden don't buy ever from ovaid kochavim. Elapshita b'makom shemachrizin. So rather than, okay, it's talking about a place where they do make announcements, and because they make announcements, so then by default, when there's no such announcement, you're allowed to buy from ovaid kochavim. And what the brisa is saying, that in such a place, and on a day when there was a treifa or a nevela at the slaughterhouse, and for some reason no announcement was made that day, right? If an announcement was made, nobody's going to be buying from the ovaid kochavim anyways. But for some reason, as Rashi says, some kind of a ones, for some reason, no announcement was made that day, and this person knows that no announcement was made, and he's selling a nevela or treifa to an ovaid kochavim, and since no announcement was made, people are going to assume that all the meat that day is kosher, and they're going to end up buying nevelas and treifas from the ovaid kochavim. So it's talking about a place where, in principle, they make announcements, and therefore you have to be concerned about Yidden buying from the ovaid kochavim. So okay, where am I? Same as fine. There's a place where they make announcements, but ema seifa. What about the final case? That a yid cannot say to Novik kochavim, here's a dinar, buy me some meat. For two reasons. One, because maybe he's a bad guy. Maybe they're going to sell him nevelas and trefus, and he's going to give nevelas and trefus to you. But if it's like we just said a second ago, a place where they make announcements, well, well, if it's a place where they make announcements, if there was a trefa or a nevela that day, they would have announced it. But if we're assuming that it's a day where they didn't make such an announcement, why would there be a concern that the ovaid kochavim would bring him back nevelas and trefas? There's no nevelas and trefas in the market that day. So rather, it must be a scenario where they don't make announcements, and therefore you would never know if there's a nevela or a trefa in the market, and therefore there's a concern that maybe he's going to be sold nevelas and trefas, and he's going to bring that to you new. So what's going on over here, right? We had three scenarios that we were just discussing. One is giving meat to ovaid kochavim. The other case is selling nevelas and trefas to ovaid kochavim. The third case is giving money to ovaid kochavim to get meat for you. Basically, we said in the first case, it's talking about, basically the first and third cases, we say it's talking about a situation where they don't make announcements in town. The middle case, we said it's talking about where they do make announcements in town. What's going on? What's going on? The first and third cases, they don't make announcements in the town. The middle case, they do make announcements in the town. What's going on here? Abai says, you understand quite excellently what is going on here. That's exactly how to understand the brisa. That though, right, scenario number 1 and 3 are talking about places where they don't make announcements, and scenario number 2 is where they make announcements. Rava Amar Kula b'makom shemachrizin. So Rava says, no, you can explain, interestingly, that the brisa is talking about only a place where they make announcements. They're talking about a place where they make announcements that if there's an nevela or a trefa, they would make an announcement. And therefore, okay, so I understand the middle case, right? Because since it's a place where they make announcements, so then by default, so long as there's no announcement, you're allowed to buy from ovaid kochavim. And that's why we're concerned that if there was no announcement that day, and this treif meat was sold to this ovaid kochavim, and there was no announcement that day, so then somebody might end up buying that meat. But what about scenario number 1, let's say? What was scenario number 1? Scenario number 1 was saying that you're allowed to give meat to an ovaid kochavim that has the gid hanasheh in it. Whether it's a whole leg or whether it's already been cut up into pieces. But if we're talking about a place where they make announcements, so don't we have to be concerned that these pieces of meat with the gid hanasheh are going to be sold to Yidden? Well, explains Rava, it's very interesting. Yeah, a place where they make announcements, by default, you're allowed to buy from ovaid kochavim. But if they make an announcement that day, you're not allowed to buy from ovaid kochavim. So it's talking about a place where they make announcements on a day where there was an announcement, on a day where they said, people, there's nevelas and trefus in the shuk, only buy from kosher butchers that day. And on that day, these pieces of these cuts of meat with the gid hanasheh were given to an ovaid kochavim, and it's okay because since there was an announcement that day that there's nevela and trefa in the market, no Yidden are going to buy that meat that day. Additionally, the last case where we're concerned that if you send an ovaid kochavim to buy meat for you, maybe you'll get nevelas and trefas. Again, it's talking about a day where there was nevelas and trefas, and they announced that day that there was nevelas and trefas. And there's a concern that maybe this ovaid kochavim, right? They sold to this ovaid kochavim nevelas and trefas. So again, Rava Omer says, Rava Kula b'makom shemachrizin. The whole thing's talking about a place where they make announcements. And Reisha v'Seifa sheichrizu. So scenario, case 1 and case 3 is talking about it's a place where they make announcements, and they made an announcement that day, and there were nevelas and treifas in the market that day. Mitziyasa shelo ichrizu, the middle case is talking about where there was no announcement that day, and therefore Yidden are going to be buying from the ovaid kochavim. We're concerned that if you sell nevelas and treifas to ovaid kochavim, Yidden will buy it. Rav Ashi Omer says, Rav Ashi kula b'makom she'ein machrizin. Rav Ashi says it's all talking about a place where they don't make announcements, and therefore people are never buying from the ovaid kochavim, and that's why you can give meat with the gid hanasheh to the ovaid kochavim, because none of the Yidden are going to buy it. And that's also a concern. Why we're concerned that in the last case, if you have an ovaid kochavim buy meat for you, it'll be sold. It'll be coming back with nevelas and treifas because it might be in the market. What about scenario in the middle where we're saying don't sell nevelas and treifas to the ovaid kochavim because maybe we'll sell it back to Yid, but if it's a place where we don't make announcements, so nobody's ever going to buy from ovaid kochavim, what's the concern? Well, the concern is well, if we're talking about a scenario where you're selling nevelas and treifas to an ovaid kochavim, where are you selling that nevelas and treifas? If you're selling it to a butcher. It's not like the Mishnah or the other cases where you're giving it to an ovaid kochavim, you're going to his house to give him as a gift. This is happening in the market, in a public area, and other Yidden can see, this meat was sold to the ovaid kochavim from Yidden. Maybe this is taka kosher meat, and even though it's a place where they don't make announcements when there's nevelas and treifas, and therefore where nobody buys from ovaid kochavim, in this case, since they're selling it directly to ovaid kochavim in the market, and people are going to see, oh wow, Yidden are right there, well, that's probably kosher meat, and they might end up buying kosher meat. So therefore, they might end up buying that meat, which is in fact nevela and treifa, and therefore we say, even in a place where they don't make announcements and people don't buy from ovaid kochavim, still don't sell ovaid kochavim nevelas and treifas out of concern that maybe Yidden are going to see the sale and conclude falsely that it's actually kosher meat and they will buy it. Friends, that was Daf Tzadi Daled of Masechta Chullin. Daf Tzadi Daled of Masechta Chullin was, in my opinion, a very interesting daf. We talked about primarily sending meat to an ovaid kochavim that has the gid hanasheh in it, and the concerns that Yidden, it might end up in the hands of Yidden. We said, look, when it comes to, if you're giving a whole leg to an ovaid kochavim, we said that is fine. There really isn't a concern there, because even if if we're in a place where Yidden aren't buying it, so they're not going to buy it anyways. If we're talking about a place where Yidden could end up buying it, if it's a whole leg, so then they'll see that it hasn't been tampered with, it has the gid hanasheh in it. And even if it's been cut up into cuts, they are going to be different than the kosher cuts, because kosher cuts have to be designed in a way that takes into consideration the gid hanasheh that's running throughout the leg. Those are going to be different than non-kosher cuts of meat, and there really isn't a concern there. When it comes to meat that has already been cut up into pieces, then there is more of a concern. We saw in a brisa later on that maybe there could be less of a concern if it's a place where nobody's buying meat from ovaid kochavim, but we did say earlier in the Gemara that there could be a concern that maybe people will see it and end up buying it. And we also got into the question of Gneivas das, which was a very interesting discussion that we got into, that alternative, you could say, even in a place where nobody's going to be buying that meat from the ovaid kochavim, still meat that has been cut into kosher cuts that still have the gid hanasheh in them still should not be given to the ovaid kochavim, even if we assume that no Jews are going to buy them, because it's Gneivas das that the ovaid kochavim who receives such meat will think that he's being given something very, very special, something that took a lot of work that went into giving this to him, and he will feel that he was receiving something special when really he wasn't, because the hard work is removing the gid hanasheh, and that was left in. So therefore, in order so that it shouldn't be any Gneivas das, we say, look, even if Yidden aren't going to end up buying that meat, don't be giving kosher cuts of meat to an ovaid kochavim that still have the gid hanasheh in it, because it can be misleading. And we got into a whole discussion about saying how it is forbidden to be misleading to other people, and this is whether being misleading to a Yid or being misleading to a non-Yid. Either way, it is not allowed Friends, that was Daf Tzadi Daled, Daf 94 of Masechet Chullin. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day.